get started. So I see I have some old friends and some new friends in here today. So yeah, and there is room right up front. I promise I won't call on you if you sit here. They're safe. All right, so I think we have a couple of hours this morning, and then a couple of hours this afternoon, and we have I think, fairly mixed group, heterogeneous group, but it looks like maybe more. I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you are master's students? And PhD students? And faculty? Just a few, okay. So for faculty, I presume you could teach this also. So I'd appreciate also your comments along the way as well, because I'm sure I certainly don't know everything about this topic. So please, if you have ideas or thoughts, please share with the group. I'd appreciate also, hearing your wisdom as we go along. I also have less of an understanding, of course, of publishing. I have worked in Japan and in Beijing and other international places, and I think I understand how important it is to publish in English language journals for those of you who are pursuing an academic career. And of course, I also have to publish in English language journals, but it's easier for me. That's my first language. And I work at a university in the US. So that's a whole other layer of challenge, I think, for all of you. So if you have thoughts or ideas or questions specifically more related to that, I'll do my best to answer. And then I also rely on the faculty here to help, because I'm sure you have much more experience with navigating that, publishing in an American or European journal, in terms of promotion for those of you who are, wanting to get a job in academia or already have a job in academic setting and want to get, promoted. I know that publishing in the English language journal is important. And the tips I have to share, I think, will be helpful for that. But again, you have this whole other layer of the language issue that I know can be challenging. And I wish I could just fix that. That takes a whole other kind of hoop you have to jump through. Even though all of you have very, very good English, it's very difficult even for a native speaker to write well. Many of us don't really learn how to write well in school. And certainly, I'm often teaching doctors, and most doctors are terrible writers. Not just handwriting, but just because we learn how to just write very quick summaries, quick notes, but they're not really well put together. So, all right. So just to, so why me? Why should you pay attention to me today? Well, partly because I've done a lot of research and I've published a number of papers. So really the best way to learn how to write is to write. There's a joke, jokes never work well cross-culturally, but there's sort of a joke in the US, Carnegie Hall, very famous music hall. And the joke goes like this, may or may not be funny to you. I'll try. The joke goes like this: how do you get to Carnegie Hall? They're asking directions. And then the answer is practice, practice, practice. Okay. And it's the same thing with writing. How do you become a good writer? I can give you directions today, but really the only way to really improve is to practice, 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 and get feedback and practice some more and get more feedback. So, this will give you some tips, maybe some ideas, maybe something you haven't thought about, but the only way you're going to get better at your writing is to write. There's no shortcut. And then be open to feedback. You want to see feedback as a gift, not as criticism, but as a gift. Thank you so much for helping me improve. So I've also written myself. I've mentored many fellows and faculty and students on writing. So, and as you work with other people to help them improve their writing, you improve your own writing. You can see, what makes for a better sentence, a better paragraph. So that has helped me. And then I spent almost 10 years as the editor-in-chief of a pretty good medical journal. It's not, those of you in medicine have heard of the New England Journal of Medicine or the British Medical Journal or Lancet. There's about 5 journals that are sort of the best, the top, very, very top. And then, of course, if you're in basic science, it's Cell or Science, just a handful. Then the next level down, there's several journals, and this is kind of the next level down. It's the Journal of General Internal Medicine. I was lucky to spend almost 10 years as the co-editor-in-chief of the journal. And there's no better way to really learn some of the secrets and tips of how to get published than to be a journal editor. So today I'll give you some kind of, as we say, sort of behind the curtain, in the back room, from a journal editor's perspective about publishing. And it's a pretty good journal. Our impact factor is 6.5 now. That's a decent impact factor. If you don't know what impact factor is, first of all, don't worry about it, but I'll explain what that means later in the talk, with a very low acceptance rate. So we reject many more articles than we accept. And if you are going to be in an academic career and want to write, you're going to get many more articles rejected than accepted. So you just have to learn to live with that. That's just it's part of the job. Part of the job is learning how to not take rejection personally. It doesn't mean it's a bad paper, or a bad idea. You'll find almost all papers eventually find a home. But, yeah. Okay. So as we have way too many people in the room to go around and I know some of you already, which is really nice, either from when I was at the School of Medicine or the last few days with many of you. But I am curious if you have any of you have one question, one issue that you're hoping I'll cover today. One thing that is on your mind that you're curious about or you're wondering about, like that's why you came. You were hoping I was going to talk about something. Do you have a specific question or concern? How many of you have published a paper already? Oh, wow, just a few of you. Okay. So the faculty, of course, raise your hands. So most of you are like, I really want to learn how to do this, and that's why I'm here. And I'm really starting with pretty basic knowledge how many of you have been involved in reviewing a paper? Again, so some more hands, interesting. I have some time at the second half talking about that, may be useful. It's a great way to learn how to write a good paper, is to be involved in reviewing. All right. So I thought mostly it would be more junior people here with less experience, so I've tried to keep it a more basic talk. But please raise your hand, stop me along the way if it's getting too complicated. or if you have questions. Okay, I don't mind if I only go through half my PowerPoint. If you have lots of questions, that's fine. I won't feel sad. I'll be happier if you have lots of questions. So maybe we'll get through all of this. Maybe we'll get through some of this. But by the end, I hope you'll learn what the essential components are of a good research paper. You're going to learn how reviewers and editors think about your work when the paper arrives at the journal. How are editors and reviewers looking at that and thinking about it? That's really important information. Tips on how to choose a journal when you're getting ready to submit. Common problems with papers, like, why was my paper rejected? Here's some reasons why. Okay, and then I'll talk some about being a reviewer and something called a thought paper. So if you haven't already written, that's sometimes a good place to start. So that's not driven by collecting data or doing research. It's more like an opinion or a commentary. And very often, most often, it's best to write that with a senior mentor because they are already well known in the field. Sorry, but if you're not already known, journals probably don't care what your opinion is, even if you're really smart and it's a really smart opinion. They're going to ask your professor to write the editorial or the commentary because they're already established. But you write with them, and then that's a good way to get your first publication and get started. So we'll talk some about what I call thought pieces, thought papers, commentaries, not data-driven. They may be an editorial, they may be another forum. Almost all journals have a place for those. They call them different things. Again, comments, opinion, perspectives, different titles for the same kind of paper. All right. So why publish at all? Why are we talking about publication? So here's some thoughts. I mean, it's the last stage of research, right? If you're collecting data, you're not really done until you publish it. You can think about it as part of your research process, right? You have an idea, you collect the data, you analyze the data, you write it up, and you get it published. These are the stages of research. That you want to change the world. Like, why are you even doing the work? You hope that it will change something. Is it going to change the way we think about policy? Is it going to change the practice, whether it be public health practice approach or clinical practice, whatever it is? You want some change to come out of all the work you've put into it. Some argue if you don't write it up, it didn't happen, right? It's just like, did anybody even ever know you did the research if you don't write it up and put it out there in the world? And some may argue that it's actually unethical because you have information, you have knowledge, and you're not sharing it with the world. You have a new insight. So you kind of have an obligation to try to publish your work, yeah? Also, just on a very practical level, if you want to be an academic, you have to learn how to write and publish. That's the way in every university, I think, in the world. If you want to get promoted, you need to be disseminating your work to a certain extent. There are different expectations, but at the University of California system, which is like 10 universities, right? A huge system, and where I work at one of them is a medical center, health center, University of California, San Francisco. For the most part, for us, it's 20 papers and a grant if you want to get promoted. About 20 papers, and then most of them should be first author. And I'll talk about authorship in a little bit, but you really want to be thinking about authorship from the very beginning. Usually, it's rare that you're going to be writing a paper all by yourself. Usually, you're going to have colleagues working. And since most of you are junior, you really want to be the one leading the research and publishing if you're like a junior faculty member. If you're a student, maybe you're not leading, maybe you're working with a professor or somebody else, but you're taking the lead on the paper, and if you're taking the lead, you should be first author. Okay, but so this is not relevant for most of you, but when I'm talking to faculty, they really care about how many papers do I need to publish if I want to get promoted. And should I be first author or second author or last author? Give me advice about that. And that probably varies depending upon the university here. You may have different guidelines, which we can get into later when we talk about authorship. Of course, there are different types of articles also. I don't think any of you are doing kind of basic science, laboratory research, which is a whole different thing than I know much less about. It's not the kind of research I do. And then there's, mostly you'll be here probably epidemiology, public health kinds of research, maybe community-based participatory research, if CBPR, if you're familiar with that as well. And I'd say in the US, more and more emphasis on including the research subjects, the community in some way in the research process, right? We're so busy studying people often, but we very rarely involve the people we're studying in the research process. And there's a big movement in the US to try to do more patient-centered research that actually involve the patients in it. They're not doing the research, but they're helping frame the question, they're giving feedback. And then there's health services research looking at health systems. I think some of you are doing that if you're interested in healthcare management or kind of systems as well. And then, of course, there's reviews. And so here you're not collecting the data yourself. It's another good way to get started. It's helpful to work to either have the statistical knowledge yourself or work with a statistician. So if I'm working with data, I'm not running I'm not doing the statistical tests myself, but I'm working closely with a statistician who's much better at it than I am, much better. So you can do meta-analyses, right? Do you know what those are? Where you're looking at a lot of different studies and you're kind of clumping them together. And systematic reviews and narrative reviews are different ways, again, of looking at the literature out there and trying to summarize what's known from the literature. A narrative review is less rigorous than a systematic review or meta-analysis. But those are good ways to get started also. They're difficult. You need to have some methodological expertise. So you want to, work with a senior person. But that's a nice way. You're interested in a topic, you even start with a narrative review. And if you look these up in the different journals, you can see they'll describe how they like to have a narrative review organized. And I'll also talk more about that in a few minutes. And then there are these others that I was telling you about, the thought pieces or editorials. In the clinical world, they may be a case report. That's the way many of our trainees get started writing, is they see a patient they find very interesting, unusual, and they write that up. And that's pretty easy generally to get those published. And it gets their name out there, it gets them a publication, a case report. And you may have something similar in public health, I'm not sure, whether you have kind of a case report type format. But again, that's another way of not having to spend a year or 2 years doing research, but you can quickly get a publication out more quickly. Questions about any of this so far? And just to check in terms of my English, how quickly I'm speaking, the vocabulary, making sense, 100%, 80%, 50%, where are we at? 100%? 80%? Okay, so if it's less than 80%, raise your hand, please, and stop me and say, can you explain that a little bit better? Okay. So what about book chapters? How many of you have contributed to a book chapter? Faculty? Yeah. So that a book chapter is also a nice way potentially to get started, and it depends upon your career path. It does help to establish your reputation in a field. It probably, in many universities, it probably won't get you promoted per se. It doesn't count really, in terms of promotion. And I said in schools of medicine and public health. Is that true in public health? That a book chapter, or is a book chapter good? Is that helpful for promotion? Professors? Good? Bad? Neutral? Good? Good. Okay, so it can be helpful. I would say for me, so this is really one of the first things I ever published was, and I was way too junior to do this. So it was a fantastic learning process for me. But this is a publication I had when I was an early assistant professor. We're now working on edition number 6, so they keep wanting to publish it, which is wonderful. It's McGraw-Hill, just a very good publisher, very wide distribution. And I had a mentor who encouraged me to write this book. He said, I don't think there's a book like this out there, and you should write it. I'm like, I'm way too junior to do that. He goes, no, you should write it, and I know a more senior person you can work with, and you can both be co-editors. That's Dr. Christensen. And it was been wonderful for me. It got me recognized as an expert, in some ways really before I was an expert. And then in the process of doing the book and doing the editions, I really developed pretty significant expertise for this. So you can think about, I'm not encouraging you necessarily to try to edit a full book. That takes a lot of work, I will tell you, a lot of work. But contributing to a book chapter can be really fun, and again, can establish your reputation in an area. And again, it depends upon where you want to go in your career. And that we talked about all of that in the mentoring workshop earlier in the week. So, all right. So actually, to publish, you need to write. That's not a big surprise to you. So I want to take a step back and just ask maybe some of the more senior people, and we have a microphone. What are some tips? What are some things that help you write? What are tips you might have for writing? Or for those of you, or any of you haven't published, how many of you are working on a paper now? 1, 2, 3, 4. The rest of you, you have an idea for a paper? Yeah? Okay, a few more. Okay. So I'd love to hear from you all, just for a few minutes, what your tips are on how do you write? What is your style? Do you get up early in the morning and write? Do you write before you go to sleep? Do you have time? How do you figure out how to write? Because if you can't find time or have tips for writing, you're never going to publish. You actually need a paper to submit if you're going to get published. So, can you share a tip? Thank you.
Usually I write in Saturday and Sunday.
The weekends, yes. There are the weekends.
Weekday we should take care about the student and the course as well.
Yes. Yes. So that's what I was also taught coming up. Yep. To grow. Actually, I had a mentor I had shared who told me if you want to write and publish, you need to write at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 a.m., which I thought was very harsh. And I do sometimes end up writing on the weekends also. I would say that, so that's certainly when we have often more time. And I would also say many of you in this room are a bit younger. And I'm finding that for your generation, you don't really want to work on the weekends. So you hear my generation say, you want to write, you should write on the weekend. And it has worked for me because I can have uninterrupted time. But you should be able to find some time during the week also, maybe. Part of that comes back to time management. And I'll share a little bit about that. Any other tips anybody else want to share? Thank you.
My name is Nana. The tips that support me to write, it's a deadline. If I have a deadline with my research, the
Yeah.
silo research, it's going to support me a lot.
Yeah.
And I often set the time on the Tuesday to Thursdays because I'm couldn't focus on the weekends. Many Netflix, it's waiting for me. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
It seems like a reward when I'm thinking about the Netflix on the weekends.
Yes.
So I have to finish it.
That's
early.
your reward. Yeah. That's great. So a deadline's certainly helpful. Sometimes it's external deadline. So I'm working on a paper now with a couple of mentees. That was actually the editor of a journal came to me and said, we'd love for you to write something. This doesn't happen very often, sometimes. We'd love for you to write us a paper for us, whatever you want to write on. Like, wow. But we need it by, September 1st. Okay. So that's great. That deadline's really helpful because otherwise we'd probably take 5 months to get it done. So we're having to really get that done. So, or you can set your own deadline, right? And say, I've got to get this done by this date. So I have to move on in my life. And then the other thing you said was you kind of set aside time in the week. You'll say Tuesday between this hour and that hour. So again, time management and planning. Let me share with you some. Anybody else? So you have to think for yourself. We're all different. Some would prefer to get up on Saturday morning and write. Some would prefer to do it another time. You're going to have to develop your own style. But here's some, and it really often comes down, this is from the last workshop, but it comes down to good time management overall, period. And, I went over this yesterday or the day before, but if you think about your life in 4 quadrants, the writing is always in the important but not urgent box, right? Unless you have that deadline and the editor is saying, I have to get your paper by this date or I'm not accepting it. That rarely happens, though. Usually, you're saying, I should really find time to write this paper, but I'm so busy with other things. Maybe next week, right? But it's really important, but not urgent. And so you want to think about how do you expand this box so that you spend more time on these important, non-urgent things. And writing is one of them. So it requires discipline and planning. So here's some comments on writing. One is, whenever you do it, try to avoid interruptions, right? Our brain is dying to be interrupted when we're writing. Any excuse to stop, right? The ding, your inbox goes ding because you have a new message that came in. Oh, great, I'm going to check my email. You get a text because you have your phone next to you. Our brains are our worst enemies when it comes to that. Our brains love distraction because writing's hard. So turn off the sound on your computer. Put your cell phone in another room if you can bear to do that. And try not to get interrupted. Even if it's just for 30 minutes, you'll be so much more effective. Break it into smaller parts. I know for me, sometimes I sit down, I need to write the paper rather than I need to just work on the first 2 paragraphs of the introduction. So you want to break it into smaller chunks. Often the advice is to start with your methods and results. Those are generally pretty short and pretty straightforward. Okay, you should know what you did with the research, and you should have your results. Maybe you create some tables. Maybe you already have some tables, and you just write that short paragraph about the results. That makes you feel good. You've gotten something done, and it's kind of the meat of the paper. And then you can build up around it, with the introduction and the discussion. But you can't have a discussion in your paper until you know exactly what the results are going to look like. So the other starting place sometimes is the abstract, because the abstract gives you an outline of here's my outline for the paper. And often you've presented it first at a meeting, and so you already have an abstract that you then have to update. Make sure you update it again, but we'll talk about the abstract in a moment. Stop when you're stuck. That's the other thing. Those of you who have done writing, or if you've done any kind of writing in school, don't you sometimes just stare at the computer screen, and you just can't get started? So get up and take a walk around the room, or take a walk around the block, or something, just to give yourself a break. And the truth is that your brain will keep working even when you don't think it is. So you take that walk, and you'll be formulating how to get started. Sometimes dictating is helpful. Instead of writing, I'll just start talking. I think there are two different types of writers also. For me, I'm very slow, but my first draft is generally pretty good. But I love working with people who can just get it out, get a draft down. It's not all that great, but the ideas are down. And if you can write like that, I think that's great. You just kind of get it out, and then you can go back and make it better. But if you're like me and you're more fastidious about each sentence is sort of precious as you're writing, and you feel stuck, take a break. You want to find an editor or colleague. This is when you have a draft done, but maybe even, so tip to you mentees, you're working with a mentor on a paper, don't wait until you think it's perfect to send it to your mentor. We all want to see it at an earlier stage, because I can promise you, even if you think it's perfect, we will not think it's perfect. We will have lots of comments for you, and we'll send it back. And then you'll feel really bad, because you'll think, I sent you my perfect piece, and now it's covered in red marks. So send it earlier on. Just do the methods and results and say, how am I doing? Am I on the right track here? And get feedback along the way. And again, always see feedback as a gift, not as a criticism. When you're writing, feedback as a gift. Someone's taking the time to read what you've written and give you feedback on it. That's like, thank you so much. Really helpful. So again, multiple drafts. You don't write one draft and say, here's my masterpiece. You have to assume that you're going to go through multiple iterations. And for those of you, you're going to start wanting to present your work in the form of an abstract at meetings. Hopefully MUPH maybe gives you the opportunity, if you're junior, to do that in forums here. If not, I strongly encourage you to do that. We'll have forums for our students or our residents or trainees who are engaged in research to share their research with their peers and their professors. It's not competitive. You just have to send it in, and it will get accepted, unlike a regular meeting. And then you get experience writing up an abstract, putting together a poster, learning how to summarize what you've learned in your research. That's a really important skill. And then if you have that abstract, you want to quickly try to get the paper out. I will say that when we look at CVs of junior faculty, they have a lot of abstracts and very few papers. That's a red flag. That means that they didn't take the time to go from this idea, this abstract, to actually write it up as a paper and get it out in the world. Because abstracts are not out there in the peer-reviewed literature in the kind of robust way. The abstract means it has not been really rigorously peer-reviewed. So you shouldn't really be using an abstract as evidence. And then I have my mentor, one of my mentors, who's about 80 years old now, said, writing is the only thing I've gotten better at as I've gotten older. And again, it's really just because of practice. Okay, and so, but also if you're looking for critique, it's nice to ask one of your peers, but also look for someone who's more experienced. Because I think that is true. You get better with writing as you write over time. So the only good thing about getting older. Everything else, no, I'm kidding. So for you junior people, and again, this is always tricky, and this is also always based in the culture of the place, of the university. It's different, I'm sure, in Thailand than in Japan, than in China, than in the US, and in Europe, etc. But I do think it's very, very important, as hard as it may be, and it's really up to the senior person to take responsibility for discussing authorship in advance. Because sure all you professors, maybe, I know I do, have a bad story, at least one bad story about authorship. You know, there was, when I was quite junior, put a lot of work into a paper and to working with a more junior person, a lot of advice. I was very, very junior at the time. And then I didn't hear from them for a while, and I assumed that they just dropped the idea. And then they came to me months later and said, oh, we want to acknowledge you. This just got accepted for publication, and we want to acknowledge you. And I'm like, oh my God, I put all this work into this. My intellectual property, you finished and wrote it up and got it published without coming back to me to ask if I wanted to co-author. And it was just, you know, they didn't mean to be mean. It was just poor communication. But as a junior person, it made me feel terrible. And for almost all faculty, at least at my university, we all have at least one story like that about authorship that did not get clarified, and then we felt bad. Our feelings got hurt. So you want to talk about it in advance if you can. The paper I'm writing now is with 2 junior mentees. They both really need and want to be the lead author. So I brought it up with them. I said, you guys, I'm going to be the senior author, the last author. For them, it's important for them to be first author, both of them. They both usually can't be. There are some journals that allow you to be co-first author. So I told them, if you're really, truly both going to do the equal amount of work, you should look into that option. And if not, decide who's going to take the lead now, so that in a month from now, when the paper's, you know, when a lot of the work has been done, no one's feeling resentful. No one's feeling badly. So really important to talk about it in advance. And I know it's sometimes hard because we all have had senior professors who maybe don't do any work and they want their name on the paper. And that's not really okay, but I know that's a whole other cultural conversation. And it happens everywhere in the world, not just in Thailand or Japan or China. It happens everywhere. And hopefully that will change over time. Because if I didn't contribute to the work, I shouldn't be an author on the paper, even if I'm the head of the department or the lab or whatever. So this is this website that is very, very helpful for all things related to publishing. Okay, it's the International Collaborative for Medical Journal Editors, I think, is what that stands for. But you can just find this site. And it has what authorship, but many, many other really important pieces of information. And authorship is based on these things: substantial contributions to the conception and design, so you come up with the idea, or you help to acquire the data, or you analyze and interpret the data. You don't have to do all of them, just any one of these. Sometimes you do all 3. If you're leading the research, you're probably doing all 3. But if I want to be a co-author on a paper, I can just talk to them about the design, and then that satisfies number 1. Number 2, then you either have to write it or help to revise it. So generally now at my stage, I'm not writing the first draft, but I'm quite involved in the next drafts and the editing. That counts. Okay, I revised it critically. And then number 3, need to approve the final version, because you're responsible for what's in that article, right? And you need to be really careful about that. I happen to know the president he was a friend of mine well before he became president of a very major university in the US. And he just lost his job because of some things in some papers that he published like 20 years ago with a postdoc that he's author on, that he had no way to know that there was like an image that was slightly changed. He couldn't really tell, but someone decided to scrutinize his work. And because he's an author on the paper, he's responsible for what's in the paper. So you need to have final approval and to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Okay. So if the professor wants their name on the paper, but they're not even reading the paper, they can be in trouble. If one of the authors in there plagiarized or cheated in some way, if you're an author on that paper, you're responsible legally, ethically, in every way. Okay, and so you need to meet 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I spent a lot of time on this only because, particularly when you're junior, you hate to bring this up. It's really hard to bring it up. But it's really good just to say, hey, I'd love to work with you on this project. Thank you for inviting me to collaborate on the research or allowing me to use your data set. I would love to be first author on this. You know, and I understand that if I want to be first author, I have to take the lead in writing the first draft and take responsibility for it. You know, can we make that clear? Is that okay? And you can ask very humbly without making any assumptions. But you do want to try to be clear, because you don't want to put all this time and effort in and then find out that you're 4th out of 10 authors, which it's not going to help you very much get a job, probably. Questions about authorship? We'll take a break in a couple of minutes, maybe soon, maybe even. Okay, so this is just a little more on authorship. And again, and maybe you can help me what the rules are in schools of public health, maybe in Thailand, Taiwan, where I am first, second, and last are considered kind of the prime positions. And if you're junior, second position is better than last. Okay, so generally first or second mean you've kind of taken more of the lead. And we don't really expect people to be last author, senior author, until you're like associate professor stage, or maybe late assistant stage. And some journals allow shared first authorship. So you can check with the journal, and there's a little asterisk. You have 2 names. One name has to come first, of course, but if you have a little asterisk there, it'll say shared first author, and that's good if that makes sense. And then there's a corresponding author, which is the author that is taking responsibility for communicating with the journal. And that's a great experience for you if you're junior, but sometimes it's better to have the more senior person do that, because that can get tricky in communicating with the editors, but that you can talk about. We don't make a big deal about corresponding author. I think maybe I don't know, in Taiwan, in Thailand, but I think it's maybe a bigger deal to like put on your CV, I was corresponding author, yeah? They look at the corresponding author. Very interesting. So she said that when you're getting promoted up to professor level, they want to see that you've been corresponding author. We don't look at that in the US. It's more, how do we get the work done? Nobody cares after that. Nobody writes it down. So again, it's not good or bad. You just have to know what the rules are, where you are, so you make sure that you're doing what you need to do. Okay, just 1 or 2 more slides, and then we'll take a break. This is maybe getting a little too detailed for most of you, but often when you're doing research, you can write a paper that describes the whole data set. You know, we surveyed the whole population of Thailand around their health behavior related to cancer screening, or whatever. And so we have, I don't know how many thousands of subjects in here, and they're men, and they're women, and they're old, and they're young. And we looked at colon cancer screening and breast cancer screening. Or you can write 20 papers out of this data set. We looked at, just breast cancer screening in women between 50 and 60, or whatever, right? You get the idea. And so you have to decide, are you going to tell the whole story, the whole package? Or are you going to give a lot of small gifts? Are you going to break it down? So you have to decide what's your main message. And then are you going to tell the whole story? Or as we like to say, are you going to make prosciutto? Right? Have you had prosciutto? Maybe you have equivalent in Thai, something very thinly sliced. So I kind of made this up, but the smallest publishable unit. So that might be in that example, just breast cancer screening in one town, over some period of time, whatever. You get the idea. And that might be, you might be able to publish that, but you're not really telling the whole story. You're breaking it. Why do people do that? Well, because to get promoted, it's better to have more papers than fewer papers usually. And so people sometimes like to just break it down and write a million different papers when it should be one story or maybe two stories. So you want to think about that, but that's way ahead of where most of you are at now. But just something to think about. I think the more important point is you want to think about what's your main, if you're writing up a paper, you want to think, what is your main message? And how do you package it? And different journals want a different package. Some are going to be more interested in what are the policy implications, because they have policymakers who read the journal. Others might say, how does this change clinical practice? Because they have a lot of clinicians. Others may say, how does this impact how we should approach public health? Generally, maybe public health policy, because it's a public health journal, and that's their audience. So you want to be thinking about, what's the story I have to tell? Because in the end, your paper is just telling a story, right? You're just telling a story. And who's the audience? Is this a bedtime story? Is this for grown-ups? You know, who's the story for? And then you want to package it in that way so that the story makes sense to the journal. So let's take a break. Before we break, are there questions or comments? And I just want to check in to see, for those of you who are more of you than I thought, who haven't published anything at all yet, does this make sense? Are you able to, might this help you when you do sit down and start writing a paper? Or is it too abstract? Which is what worried me a little bit. It would be too theoretical, but I don't know how to make it more practical. Again, it's really hard to learn how to write if you're not writing. You know, maybe I come back in a year when you're all working on a paper. But that's when you really can start kind of applying some of these concepts to getting a paper done. And we can take a look at your introduction or take a look at your background and your abstracts and give you some feedback there. But maybe if you keep the slides set, you kind of remember some of what I said, maybe you're taking some notes. When you do sit down to write, maybe some of this will be helpful for you. We'll get into now in the next part the more nuts and bolts, as we say, the more details about how to construct a paper. Okay, and I think that will be helpful for you, because for most of the writing you're going to do, it's kind of a formula. The paper outline's not that complicated. I'm not saying it's easy to write, but you don't want to turn it into something more complicated than it is. You know, you're not making it up every time. You just follow the formula and make sure you put in the right information in the right place, and then voila, the paper's done, like magic. So why don't you take a break? If you have questions, you can also come up to me and ask during the break.